You are listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's Thursday night. Welcome to the Intrepid radio program with me, your host, Scotty Roberts, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network, and that is at odyssey1.com, ODYSY1.com. You can also join the show in a simulcast, the video version of this show over on my YouTube, which is Mr. Scotty Roberts. And while you're there, subscribe to my channel. Click the little bell, you'll get notifications, and you can join in the live chat room during this show. And that's always fun to share your ideas with me while I'm doing the show, as well as the other people that are there. So thanks for being here today. I want to continue on with this story of Captain Kirk. And he was my hero as I was growing up, a boy in the late 60s and early 70s, and all the way through the 70s. Kirk was my hero. There are a lot of things about Kirk that came out in my psyche at the time. I used Captain Kirk as a surrogate, subconsciously, for the missing father in my life. This is what a lot of guys my age did. We found a connection, an affinity, and we made a hero out of this guy. Some guys went to sports and sports characters. Other guys went to action heroes like this. Kirk was somebody that appealed to me on a level not only because of the science fiction framework in which he was placed, but because of the kind of character that he was. This is who I wanted to grow up to be and what I wanted to be like. And I will tell you this, back in the, when was it? It would have been the mid-1980s to the early 1990s. I was going through a marital breakup and was seeing a marital therapist who also wanted to talk to me in private. And a lot of things about Captain Kirk came up from my past. And suffice it to say for this program, without getting into that whole story, she said you would be surprised how many men your age that grew up in the 70s idolized Captain Kirk and had some of the same issues of using him as this subconscious surrogate. It wasn't like when I was a 10, 11, 12-year-old kid that I came up and I said, Captain Kirk is going to be the surrogate for the father that is not in my home. That's not what happened. It was all subconscious because you clicked into things about him. And this clicks into some of the things we were talking about with Kirk's personality yesterday, is that he was a likable person. This was one of his command attributes. You can't just be a leader and not have certain attributes in place that make you a good leader. So when you look into this and you start asking what made Kirk a good leader, you have to look at the different personality traits that he had. So one of them, he was likable. And then we went into the fact that he was extroverted, which we translate many times outside of psychological speak as adventurous, romantic. All of those things. Romantic, I don't necessarily always mean, love relationships and stuff, although he had plenty of those. But the romanticized lifestyle was what drew him. I have a mantra for life that I've mentioned many times on this show, and that mantra being an old quote of Mark Twain's, where he said, 20 years from now, you'll regret more the things you didn't do than the things you did do. So cast off from the safe harbor. Set your trade winds, your sails to the trade winds. Explore, dream, discover. That's the romantic, adventurous lifestyle. And this is something that Kirk, as a character, was drawn to. That's how he was written to be. This is how I believe William Shatner perpetuated him in that series. And of course, we've got to throw in once again the caveat, we're talking about a fictional character here. We're not talking about a real life person, somebody out of history. We're talking about a fabricated, imagined hero. But remember, there are archetypes to the great heroic. If you pick up Joseph Campbell's book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and you read that, all through history there are archetypical types that were the heroic. And Kirk had to fit into all of these. So while Kirk is a fictional character, he is an amalgam of what humanity has seen as the archetypical hero. And so he had all these qualities in place. And that makes him a character that we can all, in one form or another, identify with. And some of us identify with different things about Kirk. I identified with that side of him, with who he was, what made him a leader. And those were actually some of the qualities, believe it or not, that I brought into my own leadership skills. Whether I was, when I was a creative director in an ad agency, in several ad agencies over the years, I was a leader of people, not military, not exploring the universe, things like that, but I was a leader of a group of people, a group of creatives within a company structure. And being a leader, you couldn't be an asshole all the time. You had to develop certain things about your personality that made you approachable, that made people want to stay and be loyal to you and work for you. This is what a good leader will nurture, if you will, to use a more tender word, in the people that he is commanding. He wants those people to follow him to the gates of hell and back. He will do everything he can to preserve them, to work for them, but he also wants them to be with him and work for him. Why do you think you had guys like Spock, who as the series progressed, did not really want to separate himself from Captain Kirk? While you see some conflicts that were brought up in the movies, which, they were rough for me when I saw it in the J.J. Abrams universe, where Spock had his problems with Kirk and separated himself from Kirk for a time, things like that. Their friendship, when they were showing that, hadn't really solidified quite yet. And so once that friendship was solidified, Spock and Kirk were constant allies, all the way up to death. And so you see this, you have to foster that in any kind of leadership situation that you have. When I worked in a company, I wanted my employees that worked for me to want to be there. So I tried to create an atmosphere that made them want to be there, while at the same time maintaining the buck stops at my desk. And what I say goes, but I can command that. I can demand it, but you have to earn it. You command it when you've earned it. And I think this is a quality we saw in Kirk. And just to do a little recap of him, I've just called up some information here that's easy to find on the internet about Kirk. You could do this off the top of your head if you're an avid fan, but it's always good to have something in front of you. James Tiberius Kirk, as we know, was born in Riverside, Iowa, in the year 2233. Hasn't happened yet. Fictional, science fiction, futuristic character. He was raised by his parents, George and Winona Kirk. And although he was born on Earth, Kirk lived for a time on Tarsus 4, where he was one of the 9 surviving witnesses to the massacre of 4,000 colonists by Kodos the Executioner. And we mentioned him as one of the leaders in Star Trek that was also a villain who was trying to escape his past in that episode, Conscience of the King. That's where he played a Shakespearean actor in his old age, but he was recognized by O'Reilly, I think it was. One of the crew members recognized him, and from his childhood, and that was all brought out in the plot twist in that. And so Kirk was one of the witnesses of that massacre, of that near genocide on Tarsus 4. And his brother, Kirk's brother, George Samuel Kirk, is first mentioned in What Her Little Girl's Made Of, and who introduced and was killed in Operation Annihilate, leaving behind 3 children. And so Kirk became the first and only student at the Starfleet Academy to defeat the Kobayashi Maru test, as we found out in The Wrath of Khan, where we started to learn more and more information as the series went on into the movies. We got to know these characters a little deeper and what made them up. He garnered a commendation for his original thinking for reprogramming the computer to make the no-win scenario winnable. And so one of the things we learned about Kirk along the way, as he said as he was biting into an apple on the Genesis planet, I don't like to lose. He doesn't believe in the no-win scenario. And so he was granted a field commission. He was an ensign, posted to an advanced training aboard the USS Republic. He was then promoted to lieutenant, junior grade. He returned to Starfleet Academy as a student instructor. Students could either think or sink in his class, and Kirk himself was a stack of books with legs, as he was once described. And upon graduating in the top percent, Kirk was promoted to lieutenant, served aboard the USS Farragut. And while assigned to the Farragut, Kirk commanded his first planetary survey and survived a deadly attack that killed a large portion of the Farragut's crew, including his commanding officer, Captain Garavik. And he received his first command, a spaceship roughly equivalent to a destroyer, while still quite young. This is the early history we've learned of Kirk. Now, by the way, this is pre-J.J. Abrams universe. So Kirk became Starfleet's youngest starship captain after receiving command of the USS Enterprise for a 5-year mission, 3 years of which are depicted in the original series Star Trek. And by the way, backstories are important in literature. When you're creating a character and you want that character to be credible, you have to create a credible backstory. I was once affiliated with the Minnesota Renaissance Festival, and we all had characters out there that were street characters that interacted with people. Now, when you're out on the street and you're interacting with people in character as part of that village, they don't need to know your history. But you build your history so you know what your character is going to be like. All of this stuff was the same with this fictional character, Kirk. They had to build a backstory for him. And his most significant relationships in the television series are with his first officer, Spock, his closest friendship, his chief medical officer, Dr. Leonard McCoy, who he called Bones. And McCoy is someone to whom Kirk unburdens himself, and it's a foil to Spock. And Robert Jewett and John Shelton Lawrence's The Myth of American Superhero describes Kirk as a hard-driving leader who pushes himself and his crew beyond human limits. Terry Erdman and Paula Block in their Star Trek 101 primer noted that while cunning, courageous, and confident, Kirk also has a tendency to ignore Starfleet regulations when he feels the end justifies the means. Now, isn't that a great quality of the hero? That's what we see. The hero is one who will obey the law, but sometimes he steps outside the bounds of the law and the regulations in order to accomplish something that he knows is right and good, even if it could mean his losing rank or his being disciplined or possibly even dying in the process. He's the quintessential officer. He's a man among men and a hero for the ages. And although Kirk throughout the series becomes romantically involved with various women, when confronted with a choice between a woman and the Enterprise, what was his response? All of you know this. His ship always won. His one true love was the Enterprise. And so Roddenberry wrote in a production memo that Kirk is not afraid of being fallible, but rather is afraid of the consequences to his ship and crew should he make an error in judgment. Roddenberry wrote, and this is out of his memoirs, or his notes, he said, Kirk has any normal man's insecurities and doubts, but he knows he cannot ever show them, except occasionally in private with ship's surgeon McCoy, or in subsequent moments with Mr. Spock, whose opinions Kirk has learned to value so highly. Now in Star Trek, let's move forward a little bit, in Star Trek The Motion Picture, which, by the way, when that movie came out, all of we Star Trek fans, we Trekkies, as we were known back then, in 1979, when that movie hit, we were waiting with bated breath for that movie to hit. We had been watching Star Trek in reruns, perpetual syndicated reruns for years, and now we were going to see it again, and it was fabulous. The movie wasn't the best movie out there. Way too overtime in special effects and slowness, and it was like another episode, really was what it was. But you were seeing your characters, your heroes, again. And so he had been promoted to Admiral, Chief of Starfleet Operations. And he takes command of the Enterprise from Captain William Decker. We remember that, and I think Kirk was a little brash in his decision to do that. He just found a way to do it, as Decker continually reminded him throughout that story. Star Trek creator Gene Roddenberry's novelization of Star Trek the Motion Picture depicts Kirk married to a Starfleet officer killed during a transporter accident. And at the beginning of Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, Kirk takes command of the Enterprise from Captain Spock to pursue his enemy from the Space Seed, Khan Noonien Singh, played by Ricardo Montalban. And the movie introduces Kirk's former lover Carol and his and her son David Marcus. Spock notes that commanding a starship is Kirk's first best destiny. And Spock, of course, as we all know, dies at the end of Star Trek II, Wrath of Khan. Then in Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, Admiral Kirk leads his surviving officers in this successful mission to rescue Spock from a planet on which he's reborn. A weird science fiction storyline that makes that happen, because, of course, once you die, you're never really dead. But Kirk rescues Spock. And although Kirk is demoted to captain in Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, because he disobeyed Starfleet orders, he stole a starship, he ruined that starship, he's destroyed that starship. He also receives the command of the new Enterprise, the NCC 1701-A. It reminds me of what Scotty says, the Enterprise, when he's rebuilding the Enterprise in the holodeck, in Relics, that episode of Star Trek The Next Generation, where they find Scotty locked in a transporter flux problem, and it's 75 or so years later, 80 years later, and he has the holodeck reproduce the bridge of the original Enterprise. He goes, not bloody A, B, C, or D. And so, just the bridge. And so, the ship is ordered decommissioned at the end of Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. So in Star Trek Generations, Jean-Luc Picard finds Kirk living in the timeless nexus after he had died in the previous movie. Despite the fact that history recorded his death during the Enterprise B's maiden voyage. So Kirk, having fallen into the Nexus, is in the incident that caused his death. Picard convinces Kirk to return to Picard's present to help stop the villain Sauron from destroying Viridian, 3's son. And although Kirk initially refuses the offer, he agrees after realizing the Nexus can't give him the one thing he's always sought, the ability to make a difference. This is where the character of the man came out again. The two leave the Nexus, stop Sauron. However, Kirk is mortally wounded as he dies. Picard assures him that he helped him make a difference. And Picard buries Kirk on the planet. And in the immortal words of the dying Captain Kirk, not to be stolen, well, to steal them from Sulu and George Takei, "Oh my," was Kirk's last words. And so this was the career of Captain Kirk. This is who he was. These are the things that drew us to him as an audience, as fans. And so let's get back into the things that made him who he was, and the things that timeline of his life made him grow into who he was. And by the way, in the J.J. Abrams universe, that timeline gets all screwed up. Kirk doesn't go to the Farragut. He doesn't go in all of these early experiences. He goes right from Starfleet into almost accidentally taking command of the Enterprise. and that earns him the position of captain. So J.J. Abrams' universe, the new canon, so to speak, sideswipes all of that history of Kirk and builds a new history for him. And he becomes the captain of the Enterprise. So yesterday, having really established this solid hypothesis about Kirk's preferred attitude being extroverted, that romantic, that adventurous, we have to consider his dominant and interior functions. We covered a little bit of this yesterday, but this is where we ended. So I want to recap this. These are what make up what's called the spine of personality. And we were just talking about that at the end yesterday. A vertical axis between the superior function and the interior function. The spine of personality. And this defines a person's conscious standpoint. According to Sharp, who is a psychological writer, he says we can't determine the preferred attitude conclusively without also considering the dominant function to which it's attached. It's not possible to demonstrate the introverted and extroverted attitudes per se, that is, in isolation from one another. Whether a person is one way or another way only becomes apparent in association with one of the four functions. To narrow the options, you have to look at whether Kirk seems to act more from a rational and judging, that's kind of a thinking and feeling point of view, or an irrational and perceiving, a sensing and intuiting perspective. And the rational functions have an orderly, predictable organization about them that lead from data input to conclusion, how you act on that. Thinking and feeling are called rational because they're both based on a reflective, linear process that coalesces into a particular judgment. And we do this every day. I mean, whether you are introverted or extroverted, we have to look at data and process that and determine how we're going to act. This is what Kirk did. This is the kind of person he was. By contrast, the irrational functions, which they're called, are not oriented to a reasoning process. They take in raw data as it is, fully formed. The physical perception of something does not depend on logic. Things just are. So similarly, an intuition exists in and of itself. It's just there. That's intuition. And it's present in the mind, independent of reason or a rational process of thought, is where that resides. And with this qualification in mind, it appears very apparent that Kirk is more of the irrational thinker. You get that? He's irrational because he takes the data and he processes it linearly and then acts and makes his conclusions. He doesn't always act on just straight intuition. There's nothing remotely methodological about Kirk's approach to life. He reacts to the situation in the moment. He's operating on an instantaneous assessment of the facts and trusting his interpretation and conclusions without any hesitation. Bam, he's in it, he's on it, he acts. He expends no efforts on explanations unless he's forced to, in order to convince others to follow his lead. But he would clearly prefer to simply direct rather than to have to persuade people. This is who Kirk is. And at that, we've come to the end of the first segment. We're going to pick this right up after the break. So you guys stand by for 2 minutes. Sit tight. I'll be right back. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Thanks for sitting through the break. It's good to have you back for the second segment. We're talking about James T. Kirk, my hero, probably your hero as well, from Star Trek, the glorious captain, the hero, the one who fits in and is defined really by Joseph Campbell's The Hero of 1,000 Faces, or with 1,000 Faces. He is the archetype. That there are personality traits we're looking at that make up Kirk. And I think that while this is not important for life in general, to solving problems with the environment or politics or impeachment or anything like that, this is important for our minds. These are things that we look at. We are driven by literature. We're driven by history. We're driven by the heroic. We're driven by the things that make us want to be something better than we are. And this was actually, rather than Freud, one of the other fathers of psychology was Adler, who said we look to the future, we look to the things that we want to be, and we pull ourselves toward those things. That's what Kirk does. That's what an examination like this does. And folks, you're listening to, by the way, the Intrepid radio program, part 2 of today's show. And it's over on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. And you can also join the YouTube channel, my YouTube channel, Mr. Scotty Roberts, and join us for the video simulcast of this broadcast. And you can also talk in the open live chat there as the show is going on. Be sure to come in, subscribe, like it, and you'll have a lot of fun over there. You can share your ideas as the show is going on. So, Kirk, as we were ending in the last segment, has this exceptional ability to take in disparate data and to connect the points into a pattern. It enables him to read a novel situation and accurately anticipate the adversary's next move. And nobody else can see that coming half of the time. But Kirk's got it because of his able to take in data and make the connections. The first example of this talent occurs when Kirk realizes in a flash that the electrical storm in space that's reported to be occurring around the planet Vulcan is the same phenomenon described in a dispatch about a remote Klingon colony that was recently destroyed. Now we're talking about, of course, the new J.J. Abrams universe. And the same phrase was used to describe the attack that had killed his father 25 years earlier. So seeing the pattern clearly, and in a flash of insight, Kirk realized this allows Kirk to realize that the Enterprise is about to stumble into a trap laid by the same enemy. And so when Kirk tries to tell Captain Pike of the danger, he has to document the specific data points upon which he based his conclusion. And only then is his argument deemed logical. This incident points out to a dominant, perceiving type, rather than one who defaults to judgment. So Kirk, while he had this extroverted, romantic, adventurous, make the decisions now, and he can take the data and process it linearly and spit it out into action, he also has this ability to have the perception to have to interpret the data for other people. He would rather just make his move. And this is one thing they got really accurate in J.J. Abrams movies about Kirk. He wanted to just move and take action, but he had to stop and convince other people. So he knew what he was doing. He could be the leader, but he wasn't the actual leader at that time. So an effective way to determine which functions are more developed and operational, as we look at Kirk here, is to examine how people deal with difficult situations. Do they think their way out? Do they wait for a hunch or an intuition? Do they use observation or sensation to find loopholes? Or do they try to solve the problem with feeling through another person? Kirk's problem solving that we found all throughout his life as we've seen it in Star Trek, his problem solving approach is exemplified in his response to the attack on Vulcan. It's clear that he's neither feeling into the situation through another person, nor is he thinking his way through in a methodological and logical fashion. Instead, He's combining the sensory information he's accumulated over time. Lieutenant Uhura's overheard description of the attack on Klingons and Kirk's reading of Pike's dissertation on the attack on his father's ship both come together in his mind in like a lightning bolt, a sudden revelation of what it all means and what it implies about the current situation. This is what made him a commander. This is what made him have that leadership ability. He could put this data together, instant connections in his mind. And there's no way to trace the process of his cognition because it happens all at once. Only afterward can he go back and superimpose a logical framework on his reasoning. So based on this analysis, it would appear that Kirk, his dominant function is either sensation or intuition, and whichever one of these is not dominant must be the inferior function. So what would you say it is? Sensation, or is it intuition? So now the psychological writer Wheelwright offered a clue to distinguishing which function is dominant and which is inferior, stating that the former is within the conscious control of the individual, and the latter seems instead to control the person. The superior, the developed, and inferior, undeveloped functions are equally potent in everyone. Whereas the individual's dominant rule, the superior one, the inferior one inevitably rules the individual. Because it's preferred, the dominant function is likely to be most often used and therefore more highly developed than the other functions in the personality. And while the inferior function, which cannot be employed at the time as the dominant, falls into disuse and atrophies, remaining mostly undeveloped and therefore mostly outside of consciousness. For Kirk, it's not immediately apparent whether he uses his sensing function first or last. It is central to his ability to produce accurate conclusions and insights, but it seems to be something that's happening to him rather than something he does. The extroverted sensation, types as realists, inundated with objective data from the outer world, relentlessly, restlessly moving from one experience to the next experience, constantly seeking physical thrills and pleasure of the senses, pragmatic and flexibly adaptable to changing circumstances. By contrast, extroverted intuition is described as a function that operates where there are no facts, no moral guidelines, no proven theories, only possibilities and unknowns. So this type will be at ease with impossible situations, with no-win scenarios. It's a paradox, and it's innovation. It's willing to take the most unconventional perspective to solving a problem without reliance on proven methods or perceived, received, taught, learned wisdom. They're also known for being disconnected from their bodies, meaning physical, stoical, sometimes owing merely to unawareness. In both films with the J.J. Abrams universe, and then the third film, we see the evidence of both extroverted situations and sensations. Intuition in Kirk at different times in order to discern and him to be able to discern which is his dominant or superior function. And it's not conscious. We have to look for what he tends to rely on the most, what he does first, what he has most fully developed. What do you see in Kirk? What's he most fully developed? Does he think through? Does it come naturally for him? Is it a combination of the two? In J.J. Abrams' Into Darkness, Kirk is again in a position to render a radical interpretation of events and anticipate an enemy's next move. Are these the things that make good strategists? When you hear of military leaders who are excellent strategists, it's because, yes, they've book-learned strategy. They've academy-learned a strategy. Experience-learned strategy. But is the good strategist somebody who simply has learned how to do it from a book, or somebody who has these innate abilities? Kirk's in the company of Starfleet's senior leadership group as they review a recent bombing and evaluate what their response should be. With one ear turned to the discussion in the room, Kirk focuses on the video of the event, zeroing in on the antagonist seen fleeing the scene. But it's not the physical evidence that brings him to his startling conclusion, but rather some flash of insight. He suddenly knows, he just knows, that the bombing was just a ploy intended to trigger a gathering of Starfleet Command in one room, where they will all be vulnerable at the same time to attack. This is an entirely intuitive leap. It's not based on any perceptual data that Kirk has received. Coming out of nowhere, it fully formed into Kirk's conscious mind. Boom. Internal to external. Intuitive thoughts come out of the blue, so to speak, as a hunch or a guess. And there's an extraordinary, remember Spock? That made me think of Spock operating on a hunch. It was trouble for him, but he did it once. There's an extraordinary ability to sense what's going on behind the scenes, under the surface. So the difference between this extroverted sensation and intuition states that the former is oriented to an intense experience of the physical world, and the later is focused on generating multiple options. Where extroverted sensation seeks the highest pitch of physical realism, extroverted intuition strives to apprehend the widest range of possibilities inherent in the objective situation. And whereas sensation types see only what's in front of them, intuitives see the same scene transformed, as if in some kind of inner vision. And the former limit their scope to the concrete facts of outer reality. The latter translates these into meaningful insights about what's really going on. So, based on his knack for creative and startling insight, together with his disregard for physical limitations, you have to conclude that Kirk, his superior function, is extroverted intuition. So he's an extrovert, and his inferior function is combined with that extroverted intuition. So accordingly, types are described as driven to build future possibilities from objective data in the environment, to form a series of verifiable links that create patterns and possibilities, and to see the patterns and connections that shape future alternatives. And so those with dominant extroverted intuition, like Kirk, use their observation of outer reality to form interrelated systems of information in an instant that coalesces into one or many versions or visions of what could be. They're not non-linear in their thinking, oriented toward future possibilities, sometimes unfiltered or even indiscriminate in their evaluations of options, and often bored or chafed by structure and conventional ideas. Kirk, as we have learned, is adept at finding innovative solutions to disparate and desperate situations that appear to have no chance of a positive outcome. And he's not averse to breaking the rules in order to beat the odds and achieve his goals. This is what Kirk was. This is what he was good at. This is the personality we see emerging in this character. The being Captain Kirk, as the title of this little series is all about. It's examining the psychological makeup of this fictional character, which is really very real psychology and things that you can look to. I would be more than happy to promote a Captain James T. Kirk to my own kids, to anybody in a class I might be teaching, to a lecture I might be giving, to say these are qualities that are real qualities in a person that have been brought out and displayed and illustrated, demonstrated in this fictional character. So taking this character and using him as a role model for these things, no matter what you thought about, his whorishness, his womanizing, or whatever you might want to, his other faults, whatever they might be, this is a person who has internal genius level working to be able to combine and interrelate the intuition with the extroverted. So one example of Kirk's innovative problem solving occurs when, as a cadet in Starfleet Academy, he's faced with a test that all potential captains have to undergo. And it's by design an unbeatable test. We heard it mentioned in Star Trek Wrath of Khan. We saw it played out in the J.J. Abrams movies. So the role play is deliberately designed to be impossible to pass in order to expose the initiate, to the experience of fear and test whether or not he or she can function effectively and maintain self-control in spite of certain death. This is what the Kobayashi Maru test was supposed to be all about. It was supposed to be how you handle yourself in a situation where there is no way out. So Kirk has already failed the test twice, and he demands a third retake, an unprecedented act, and a sign of his bullishly stubborn, apparently self-defeating determination to overcome insurmountable obstacles and win. He wants to win. He doesn't believe in losing. I don't like to lose, he said, as he crunched an apple in Star Trek 3. I'm sorry, Star Trek 2. 3, The Wrath of Khan. You know what I'm talking about. Search for Spock. And so as Kirk says, Star Trek 2, Wrath of Khan. Yeah. As Kirk says, echoing Pike's reminiscence of his father, he says, I don't believe in a no-win scenario. And he's successful in defeating the test, but only because he had reprogrammed the simulation, thereby violating the ethical code of the Academy. He cheated in order to win. And what was it Spock said to him when he first learned of this? He says, you cheated. And Kirk said, I redefined the conditions of the test. And in this scene, Kirk demonstrates his predilection for thinking in unconventional ways. He refused to be limited by the known and the familiar, and being unafraid to challenge the status quo to achieve the impossible. This is what he started showing at that stage. His cognitive process is improvisational, intuitive, nonlinear, and exceedingly quick. He arrives at a fully formed conclusion almost instantly, with little trace of an orderly progression of thought, based on his acute observation of the facts presented in the situation. So here is James T. Kirk showing us that he has this ability to achieve the winnable in an unwinnable situation. He said, I may not be able to win through the existing conditions of the test. Therefore, I need to change the conditions of the test. And he wins. And so having reached a provisional hypothesis that Kirk's superior function attitude is extroverted intuition, it's necessary to observe that his auxiliary functions may be in order to establish his 4-letter type code. So if the dominant is an irrational function, then the auxiliary and tertiary functions are going to be rational. Those are the ones he doesn't use quite as well. He may seem rational. His thought process is what's labeled as the irrational. So that is either thinking or feeling have to be one of the two that he consciously chooses. Thinking or feeling. We all know that Kirk feels, and he feels deeply. But we all know that he can elevate his thinking above his feeling. I'm not talking Vulcan logic here, eschewing of feeling. He just puts it above or below thinking. And as the argument goes here with Kirk, the attitude alternates with each successive function. So that if the dominant function expressed as extroverted, then the auxiliary function is going to appear as introverted. You can theorize a bit that the auxiliary function is geared toward caretaking of other people, unlike the functions of the spine, which are oriented primarily toward one's relationship with the self. So the auxiliary, I'm having a problem saying that word today, auxiliary function can be understood as normally the second most highly developed of the 8 function attitudes. And we're all talking psychology here without getting into a psychological lesson. So supporting the activity of the dominant function. It works in concert with it. It provides a balancing energy to it. So assuming that Kirk's superior function is this extroverted, intuitive, his auxiliary is, for Pete's sake, his auxiliary would have to be either introverted feelings or describing or introverted thinking. So distinguishing thinking from feeling, both judging functions as a matter of describing versus interacting with reality. So thinking is concerned with efforts to describe or represent realities. Feeling is concerned with efforts to influence or to interact with realities. And further, any proposed representation of a reality is a hypothesis. Any proposed interaction with a reality is a maneuver or a strategy. You get that? Any proposed representation of a reality, anything we propose or hypothesize, is a hypothesis. Any interaction with a reality is a maneuver or a strategy. So thinking is about defining, and feeling is about valuing. And Kirk had both of these things going for him. And I see we've only got a few minutes left here, and we're going to be done. And we're going to have to take Kirk into tomorrow, too, because I don't have enough time to get through all this material. Kirk is much more given to evaluating situations. He evaluates people. He evaluates things. He's more given to all of that than he is likely to spend time analyzing or classifying people or things or events. He has a talent for assessing other people's motives and understanding what drives them. Now, using empathy indirectly is kind of a strange tool for Kirk, because Kirk can relate to the anguish of a villain, such as Nero in the Star Trek, the first J.J. Abrams movie, or Khan. He can understand Khan, where he's coming from. Both of whom are acting out of revenge for the annihilation of their own people. Did you notice that about those two villains? Their own people were annihilated, and that's what sparked them to do the evil things that they're doing now. He can see the world enough through their eyes to play a game of manipulation with them. He provokes them where they're vulnerable. He anticipates their next moves. These qualities strongly suggest that James Kirk has developed his introverted feeling function more than the thinking function. Further evidence for this conclusion can be drawn from his dependence on a subjective system of values and beliefs that override and take precedence over conventional principles and standards. They rely on their unique framework of internally synthesized concepts. This is what Kirk is doing. His synthesized concepts, his principles, his knowledge, his convictions, if you will. Kirk has a tendency to justify his own actions by appealing to this higher order of morality An example of he has this internal archetype of what's true and right, and he knows what's true and right, especially when this conflicts with the rules and the regulations he has to live by. An example of this can be seen in his defense that because the academy test itself is a cheat, intended to be impossible to pass, it's therefore legitimate to cheat the test. You see how his mind works? It's a cheat. I don't believe in the no-win scenario. It's a cheat. It doesn't exist. There is always a way to not lose. And it's therefore legitimate to cheat the test. So, the feeling function, and we got to end on this, as one that relates subject to object to the contents of one's psyche as values, and to one's subjectivity as general feeling of tone and mood. In other words, the feeling function is what binds things and people together in a value-based relationship. Everything is judged for its worth, and for the introverted feeling type, the worth is subjectively determined and compared to an inner standard, not an outer one. So based on Kirk's preferences and more developed faculty of feeling over thinking, you have to conclude, well, I propose that his personality type would establish the position of the first 4 function attitudes in the following order: extroverted intuition, introverted feeling, extroverted thinking, and introverted sensation. This is who Kirk is. Now, we got to end here tonight. Tomorrow I want to get into integrating shadow. Another feature of personality that we see brought out in Kirk. This is Captain Kirk. And these are things we can draw from him. These are things we can recognize in him. So, I find this study of Kirk to be a lot of fun, very exciting, of a fictional character, a guy who's a hero, but also the things that make him so heroic that we can pull into, use as role models for ourselves. Being Captain Kirk. We're going to pick this up tomorrow. Folks, we got to go out for 23 hours. We're going to be back tomorrow. Glad you're here. Sit tight. We'll be back.